Okay, the Stewardship Council is called back to order. I should probably tell you that Mr. Bobker noted that during his comments, I changed the battery in one of my hearing aids. And he said, I wasn't sure you were going to put it back in. And I said, well, it's a temptation not to, but I would miss important things. Thank you, Mr. Bobker. Okay, Mr. Ray, we're on Chapter 4.
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's a good thing you did put it back in. In Chapter 4, of course, that's the chapter on protecting, restoring, and enhancing the Delta's ecosystem.
Is your mic on?
Okay.
Get a little closer, please.
Yeah, the narrative in there, a key piece of that is the definition that they included early in the chapter on protecting, and what we think it means to protect, restore, and enhance the Delta ecosystem. And then the plan includes 5 policy and 8 recommendations in this chapter targeted at creating more natural functional flows, restoring habitat, preventing and managing the impacts of non-native species, and improving the management of hatcheries and harvest. We have no issues that we believe are still open here. We think looked at the comments that we received. I know there's some concerns that folks have got on the panel, and so I think it'd be useful to hear from them. But the staff itself doesn't identify any open issues with the chapter policies and recommendations.
Yeah. And I think, as I told you, I think this chapter is much better written than it was before. Sure, there's a lot of editing changes, but better written. And there are comments, as I've been slowly reading through the letters that were handed over to us this morning that we received in the last now 18 hours. There are comments about this chapter too and some of the policies. How would you wish to discuss? I think this is one where we just go to the panel pretty fast.
I think we would hear from the panel. I've read the comments from the Department of Fish and Game and the suggestions from the Bay Institute and NRDC. I'm comfortable with the recommendations that we have made, even understanding those comments. I'm comfortable with the text that's proposed. But I'm certainly, I recognize that adjustments may need to be made to reflect the council's point of view.
All right. Well, let's do this. Why don't we? I'd like to walk through the groups again, please, on this chapter. I should note, Mr. Zuckerman has the event tonight honoring Alex Hildebrand down in Stockton, and I don't know, Mr. Machado, you're probably going to try to get out of here for that too. We're going to have to stay until we finish the thing. If you gentlemen have to leave for that early, if there's any excuse that is justified, going to an event for Alex would probably be right up there on the top, so we understand that completely. So, Tom, would you like to just kick this off?
Well, since we don't have to respond to staff open-issued comments, I can say what I intended to say when I came in. And it's in writing.
Members, there's a 2-page piece of paper with Tom's name, I think, written up on the top left-hand side, titled "From a Delta Stakeholder's Perspective." And this is the one you're talking about, Tom?
Yeah, and if you look at page 2 of that, there's
page 2 of the document.
There's a paragraph entitled "Habitat Restoration."
Right.
And quite frankly, I think this is an important point that is not sufficiently addressed in the approach, which is, I'm going to read it very quickly. Under historical hydrology, the null zone where freshwater outflow mixed with tidal waters to create a salinity gradient generally occurred in the broad and shallow Suisun Bay. Together with the extensive tidal wetlands of Suisun Marsh, this provided the great nursery for the estuarine fishes that developed in response. As upstream diversions and exports increased, the mixing zone moved upstream and the Suisun Marsh sloughs were diked off to accommodate and improve water supply from the Montezuma Slough provided by the DWR's control structure. The Delta Plan presages a solution to this problem by reserving 100,000 acres or more of productive ag lands in the Delta for the creation of new tidal wetlands. Since the criteria for these lands is at or near sea level, these are the farms least threatened by floods and most amenable to long-term agriculture or urban and industrial expansion of the nearby population centers. Reserving them under consistency jurisdiction for eventual consideration of such projects raises serious questions of inverse condemnation liability for the state and widespread economic impacts on the local communities and landowners. as there are large question marks as to whether the creation of such tidal marshes will offset rather than aggravate the problems caused by the upstream diversions and exports. We do not know that large-scale tidal marsh development in the delta will aggravate salinity intrusion problems by increasing the tidal excursion and so forth. So I'm not convinced that the approach really, I think, is flowing out more out of the BDCP stuff is appropriate, but I don't think you've accurately staged the reclamation of the delta and which occurred, largely by 1920, and the deterioration of the fisheries, which occurred 50 years later. And there's too much of a tendency here to blame it on what took place 50 years before the problems began to show up.
I actually asked that question when you gave us version 2 of the Zuckerman white paper, either late 2010 or 2011. And the science program folks sent me back some historical research trying to talk about fish species prior to 1950. And I have a faint recollection, and I apologize, I should have gone back and checked. I have a faint recollection that there was a big drop in the 1920s. Not unrelated, I suppose, to the change in ocean fishing practices for some of the fishy species that were caught extensively in the delta, the slow demise of the canneries along the delta. But
the baselines we're looking at now are 1970. That's the...
Well, no, but what I was looking at, what I asked them, because you had mentioned something like this argument before, I said, give me the history of fish species as far back as we have anything that constitutes substantial evidence. I mean, the farther back you go, the less reliable, but you have some evidence. And I'm trying to remember...
well, I'd love to see that.
Yeah, I'll find that report and send it to you.
It isn't consistent with the information that I've developed over the years.
Okay. Well, let me just ask a question on this criticism, and I skimmed at the break your statement. The Delta Plan presages a solution to this problem by reserving 100,000 acres or more. Now, contrary to all my expectation that we were going to do it, I don't really believe that the chapter mandates 100,000 acres or more. It references the range of options being considered in the Bay Delta Plan. That is true. But is there a section here that you thought said we support 100,000 acres of restoration land, which I would personally support?
There's a map.
There's a map. And that is the map, which one?
Probably page 149.
Yeah.
Okay. These are the 5 key areas for restoration sites?
Well, yeah, and I'm not sure this map, I didn't take a planimeter and try to figure out how many acres there were. I was more referencing what's coming out of the BDCP.
Okay, all right. So that is a fair point. They have a range of options that are under study, but one of them I think actually goes up to 130,000 acres, including easements. I think that's what I saw in one of their summary alternatives. But these 5 areas are, first of all, 2 of them are existing floodplain designations. The third is the Suisun Marsh with its existing boundaries. The other is the lower San Joaquin River floodplain, which a number of the local agencies have agreed conceptually on its boundaries.
But it isn't as extensive as is shown on this map.
Right.
The plan that the South Delta Water Agency and others are working on for the around Tom Paine Slough and Paradise Cut doesn't take half of Upper Roberts Island. So the point that's being made there is that the areas that they are targeting, which are the ones that are most that are up the highest, are the areas that we rely upon most heavily. And then when we get to Chapter 7, we'll talk about the lack of commitment or whatever to the preservation of the remaining areas in the central and lower parts of the delta.
How would you suggest we deal with the statutory definition of restoration that was given to us which talks about achieve a close approximation of its natural potential, meaning the delta ecosystem.
Well, I've tried to suggest here what the historical situation was, which was focused on the western part of the delta, the Suisun Bay, the Suisun Marsh, where the null zone was, and that was considered to be the most productive part of the estuary and the nursery area. And the effort to try to somehow or other pull that back up 40 miles back, into the delta and create new marsh, which never was in those areas. That was always mineral soils and high area. To me, doesn't make a lot of sense, and some of the science that's coming out of the science program is beginning to question whether this tidal marsh creation is really any kind of a solution to the problem also.
Let me jump to Mr. Wilcox, who cannot escape this discussion, even though he escaped the entire previous chapter. Mr. Wilcox, Tom's raised a point on habitat and its relationship to the Delta Plan and BDCP and all of that stuff. You want to weigh in on this, please?
I suppose so.
Get the microphone close to you, if you will.
Since, my one recommendation would be to expand the areas that are subject to the requirement based on elevation. I think, a characterization of the delta as just being the null zone is a very short-sighted consideration of what, at least in the historic condition, it was. I don't think anybody says that it's a constrained thing. The South Delta certainly was probably primarily seasonal floodplain, seasonal wetlands, grading into tidal marshes the farther you went. I think one thing that we know based on Liberty Island, which is the one place we get to look at what happens when you restore habitat in the delta in an effective way, and that wasn't even planned, is that it's a very functional system. It provides habitat benefit for things that, like the pelagic fishes that are native and endemic to the delta, provides spawning area, rearing area, even over summering habitat, which is somewhat at odds with the traditional thinking that species like delta smelt rely on the null zone. And I think underlying is the idea that we're trying to put components of the historic situation back into the delta. And that requires, and there's language in the legislation that talks about connectivity and corridors. And part of that goes to trying to reestablish some of those functions. And as Tom points out, the efforts in the South Delta to talk about floodplain enhancement and flood control and restoration down there, those are all, I think, going in the right direction. And I think they've changed the way people think about, kind of what the objective should be down there. But it's not going to be tidal. It's going to be floodplain kinds of habitat. But in other places, farther into the delta, I think our, BDCP is identified, and before that, the Ecosystem Restoration Program had identified areas of concentration. Well, I think we're having to rethink some of those, particularly as it relates to climate change and whether we do anything or not, sea level is going to rise, X2 is going to probably move upstream, and we need to have some places for it to go to that are equivalent to what was described relative to where it historically and currently at times exists within Suisun, because there is a benefit of being in that broad, shallow environment. And so I think that's kind of where the habitat restoration targets generate from. They're also trying to be somewhat realistic as what can you actually do. They don't all rely on conversion of agricultural lands. We rely on changing some upland areas that aren't currently in ag to intertidal areas, shallow tidal marsh areas, wetlands. and in Sassoon, changing the management practice in certain areas to tidal from managed wetlands. So, I think from the perspective of Chapter 2 and the department's views about not Chapter 2, but Chapter 4, we would really like to compliment the staff for working really closely with us on many of the issues and policies that are in that section, because I think the only real comment we had some kind of minor comments that were submitted yesterday, is this issue about just restricting the it's policy, or not even policy.
Limited to publicly owned lands and lands where only voluntary agreements with landowners are possible. I think that's the
right.
Dells Protection Commission recommendation.
Yeah, and our expectation is that that's the way it's going to.
I understand.
I would invite you to review the comments that were submitted yesterday by the Central Delta Water Agency, a 28-page letter submitted by Mr. Nomalini, and maybe I can get from you your historical data, Mr. Chairman, about the destruction of the fisheries in 1920, which comes as news to me, and we'll be happy to look at it.
Yeah, look, it's 18 months ago. I saw some studies. I'll send out whatever I've got to you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
On that point,
Pat?
Yeah. Do you have a comment on Tom's identification of the cause of the decline of fisheries being principally diversions and exports, thereby leading to, I would guess, although he doesn't say it in what he read, that the remedy is increased flows primarily?
Flows, as the department has commented to the state board, is an important component of maintaining healthy fisheries and particularly populations. We've seen declines that are related to increased exports during the pod period, but that it's not just flows, it's other activities, it's water quality issues, it's timing, it's the fact that the Delta is not a very heterogeneous place compared to what it historically was. These species evolved in a habitat that's very different from what it is today. So they're confined to channels. It's a very low productivity system. And that's been exacerbated by the presence of clams, introduced clams over the last 20 years. It's a number of factors, and they all compound to create a situation that isn't very helpful for these species. So it's not you just do one thing necessarily. If flow was everything, that would be really easy. But I think it's a matter of restoring heterogeneity into the system and resilience. I think what we've seen with Liberty Island in particular is that habitat can form in the Delta that is useful and helpful in the system. And if there was more of it, I think as we operate today, we're at about 5 to 10% of what historically existed in that system. And that 5 to 10% is primarily fringing habitat. It's not functional habitat. So I think it's, the idea that restoring the Delta, and this is somewhat similar to the discussion about, or how you define reliance on the Delta, it's in the eye of the beholder. And to me, restoration means putting components back into the system that allow it to operate better, irrespective of what else goes on in that system, with the objective of restoring a sustainable and resilient system that can maintain the species and the habitat attributes and the recreational and sport fishing interests that we have there, as well as the broader resources that rely on that system.
But I'm left with the comment that these changes that took place as far as the configuration of the Delta have been there for 100 years, almost 100 years. And we really haven't had a collapse of the fishery until the last 25 or 30 years. So you can't ignore the fact that we had relatively healthy fisheries with the current geography of the Delta for 50 years or so. And ignoring that fact troubles me, and it troubles the people in our area, because their conclusion is that this is a problem we didn't create, and yet the burden of solving the problem is going to be to take all of our most productive farmland, or very big portions of it, and the potential for expansion of our communities off the table. And we're going to suffer from the solution as well as we did from the exports in the first place.
All right, let's run through the rest of the panel. Mr. Rentz, on this discussion, on habitat discussion.
I think I'm going to be real brief, but I do want to make some comments about the chapter, if I could, because I think it's a very important chapter, just like the preceding one. First of all, we want to acknowledge the change in the approach that staff developed for this chapter, and I'm sorry, I took my pen out to write something down. The more natural functional flow approach, we think, provides us greater opportunities. It goes to the comment that Carl just made when he was talking about restoration. And he said restoration, I hope I got you right, Carl, is putting desired ecological conditions back into the ecosystem, characteristics you want. And as we read the natural functional flow, that's what you're talking about. Variability in the system, what are the critical ecological characteristics that the species of concern or of interest need. And that also, I think, will, over time, as we get a better understanding of that, provide us greater flexibility in the toolbox of how do we create those characteristics, which brings me quickly to my second point, which is another thing we really appreciate about the chapter is if you start looking through the recommendations that are in this chapter, a lot of them are strike me two ways in positive. Number one, they're focused on actions, things that can be taken, like hatchery policies, working with Fish and Game, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to develop safe harbor agreements with property owners, actions that can translate into proactive results. And the second part about it is what I see in this chapter with regards to your recommendations is there's also a recognition that you have to, you being the Delta Stewardship Council, have to invest the time and the resources in working with and developing relationships with the other agencies that have the authority and the ability to put in place some of these actions. Example is ER-R8 on page 154 when you talk about implement marking and tagging programs. These are the kind of things that some of them, not all of them, I think over time, in the near future, can start providing us a basis for some results. I think that's what we're all looking for. So I wanted to bring those positive points forward. The last comment I'll make, Mr. Chair, and then I know you want to move on for other people, and we didn't have a lot of specific comments, is I do encourage you to take a look at the table called Stressor Categories to Help them with Management Options on page 125.
Got it.
What struck me as I looked at that is all the factors in there, and it would imply that all the stressors associated with what we need to do that can help management options are anthropogenic, human caused. And I think if we don't also recognize that there's also some natural factors or non-human factors that are stressing the ecosystem and species in particular, then we might miss some opportunities. You've heard a lot of discussion about predation. What's that mean? We're going to have a debate on who, where, what, how much, but predation is not necessarily a human activity. The management of the predation can be a human activity. Predation out in the ocean by pinnipeds who knows how influential that is, but that, again, is not a human activity, but the management options, once you identify that, might be a contribution to restoring the species. So I'll leave it at that at this late hour in the day. Again, I want to close by, we still have a long ways to go. I guess I will leave one other comment. I think it's important. We appreciate the modifications made to ERP1 on page 146. We think it's a much more proactive approach. And in the context of that, appreciate the letter that went from you all to the State Water Resources Control Board. And what that leaves me with, since you've got a policy thing in here that talks about dates for the State Water Board to enact its responsibilities, and given the letter that you've been through, I think there's a real opportunity for collaboration between Delta Stewardship Council and the board to look at an approach to addressing these issues that will give us some more flexibility and greater opportunity. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Mr. Machado.
Thank you. Thank you. I think what we're looking at, you take a look at what Tom has said about the impacts on the agriculture in the Delta, is that we get into a situation where, again, we're taking one aspect to try to restore the system without changing the other elements or require the other elements to be responsible for some of the impacts they have had on the system. The Delta Protection Commission has asked that we look at willing participants in terms of restoration projects. Indeed, the Delta Protection Commission engages in working landscapes projects that partners with private landowners to put habitat in. I think that should be a goal and pursued more so. But I also think, too, in this chapter, and I take a look at this chapter, I take a look at the chapter on levees, and take a look at chapters on the Delta as a place, the linkages aren't really clear in terms of the Delta plan trying to achieve the co-equal goals and the objective that the legislature identified that was inherent in achieving those co-equal goals was preserving and enhancing agriculture, recreation, tourism, and culture in the Delta as an evolving place. So and that goes back to restoration versus levee standards, and we're looking at a levee standard that's focused more on financial participation by the federal government, not necessarily on the level of protection for the Delta. We're looking at restoration, levee, and then you have levee standards, and you have economic sustainability. And I don't think between the three chapters on habitat, on levees, and on the Delta as an evolving place, we've established the linkages between those three so that they work together. I think we ended up creating three different silos with that affect the Delta proper solely without necessarily bringing in all the other elements that have contributed to the change.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bobker.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start just by making a comment on the exchange that we had regarding the relative effects of habitat versus flow and how that contributed to the problems in the Delta. It seems to me that we've had sort of two waves of ecological collapse and extinction crises in the Delta. The first happened when lands were converted wholesale from wetlands and riparian areas to diked areas. It's less well documented exactly what the impacts of that were. And then we had a second wave where the massive, large-scale alteration of the hydrology has resulted in the collapse of the fisheries we've seen over the last few decades. So I think if the question is what's really caused the problem in the last few decades, then I think it's very clearly the alteration of flow and not the loss of habitat. But that doesn't mean that you don't want to restore habitat, because there are there's a broader ecosystem than just the one that's been collapsing in the last few decades. And if we want an ecosystem that really supports the broadest native communities, then we want to restore all of the pieces of that. So that's kind of the way that I would characterize it. So that that made my point. Let me get to sort of what I regard as these. We submitted written comments. There's a number of suggestions that are fairly focused on particular issues that I'm not going to get into. I want to get into sort of the big overarching issue that we raise in our comments. In my view, Chapter 4 represents a shift in thinking from a reactive, crisis-driven, single-species management approach to a landscape-level ecosystem restoration approach. And I think it's well thought out. It really focuses on the most important drivers of ecosystem health, and that is the hydrograph and the habitat mosaic. So in terms of the overarching approach, I think it is sound. What strikes me, though, about Chapter 4 is that this preferred approach is untethered from the biological and ecosystem response that we want to see. It's one thing to identify these are the large-scale drivers of change in the delta, the loss of physical habitat, the reduction and alteration of flow patterns. But it's not enough to simply say, well, what we want to do is have better flow patterns and better habitat mosaic. You have a lot of choices to make. How are you going to restore the flow, the hydrograph? How much habitat should you do? Where should you put it? What is the length of time in which you affect the duration, magnitude, frequency of flows? That's got to be focused as much as possible on the attributes of the ecosystem and of the parts of the ecosystem, the species that inhabit the ecosystem that constitute the native communities. So what's really missing is a discussion of the urgency of the draft. The chapter really describes the alteration of the system, but it doesn't really describe the alteration of the species in the system and the communities in the system and the changes in the attributes of viability that we care about. In other words, we want to make sure that the ecosystem allows for growth of populations. Species need to be able to grow. Organisms need to be able to grow when conditions are right. They need to be able to reach the areas that they need to spawn, to rear, to rest, etc. They need to have access to different places so that there's diversity of population and diversity of conditions for them, so that they, when conditions change, they're not uniform in their composition or their geographic distribution. And we need to make sure that they are at levels that are sustainable. So all of these things are really important. They're really important to guide the projects and programs that you want to encourage to restore flow patterns and restore habitat. So we would strongly suggest you do two things. One is beef up the discussion in this chapter of population viability characteristics that you care about. So when you are manipulating the ecosystem to do the restoration activities you rightly are identifying as important, you have guidance as to what it is you're trying to accomplish and some guidance as to the magnitude of what you want it to do. And that's not the same as saying you should identify X thousand acres of habitat or X CFS of desired flow. It says really link the changes in flow and habitat to the measurable attributes of population viability of the species in the Delta native community that exist in the Delta native community. So to that end, in addition to strengthening the language in there, and there's certainly a lot of material that can be used to do that. You don't have to reinvent it at all. we'd also suggest that you add specific performance measures that relate to population viability. And we would suggest the following. Progress toward restoring the population viability of the full suite of delta resident aquatic species to levels equal or greater to what we had in the period of the late 1960s to the early 1980s, which represents a period where we still had sustainable, healthy populations that were certainly not as robust as they might have been 100 years before, but certainly still represented a sustainable level of population viability. Progress toward the recovery of species that are at high risk of extinction. Ensuring survival and passage through the delta of migratory species so that under all conditions they're able to grow and reach reach the areas they need to reach, whether it's spawning areas upstream or the ocean downstream. To reducing mortality from sources that are controllable by covered actions to thresholds that allow you to maintain those viable populations, and to advance the goals of the Central Valley Joint Venture and other programs that are targeted at terrestrial and riparian species. These are overarching goals.
Gary, let me just. You've suggested, and a lot of our performance measures include the progress toward start. And it bothers me because unless at the end of that sentence is a quantifiable, measurable, observed, and reported indice, it just doesn't. There is little there except kind of an abstract goal. Now, I'm not opposed to abstract goals, but performance measures seems to me, if we're going to do them, we ought to be able to produce something relatively clearly. We've got, for example, the trawl studies that have gone on for decades.
Right.
And yes, there are some difference in technology and all of that, but basically that's a sustained base of information. Now, it's not a comprehensive metrics, but it's a performance measure that's related to something where there's a body of evidence around that at least people have chewed over for a long time. So your measures here, however, don't always have that ingredient in them.
Sure. Let me respond to that because I agree completely with you, and we have in fact in the past submitted suggestions about more specific performance measures, and frankly, this was an attempt at a compromise that, since it's our understanding that you don't intend to include or don't feel you're capable of including quantitative performance measures in this plan at this point and intend to develop them for future iterations of the plan, we were suggesting that at a minimum you should have these kinds of performance measures that at least track the kinds of performance measures that you have already in the plan. However, we certainly think that there's sufficient information to have more quantitative measures, and certainly are willing to work with the staff to identify appropriate ones to that would make these more clear and measurable if that's desired.
Randy.
Gary, I'm a little bit confused because all of the points that you made about aspects of stressors and desired species are included in our output performance measures, outcome performance measures. Trends are stated, goal trends are stated. In one case, population goal is stated. If I hadn't read this and I heard your testimony, I would have thought that staff screwed up and didn't include any of this. But what you just asked for is already there, lacking exact numbers. But the trends that you're seeking are specified as performance measures.
Well, the way that I'm reading your outcome performance measures, I'm not really seeing that. So,
non-native species?
Well, let's put it this way. Measuring a decrease in non-native species is a good thing. What I'm focusing on is progress toward the response by native species.
Okay, it's in there too. In fact, the doubling goal is reiterated.
Yeah, no, I agree. The doubling goal is appropriate, although it's relative to 1995 levels, and I'm not quite sure what that means. But what you have here is that trends in occurrence, et cetera, and use of species will be upward. What I'm doing is actually trying to link that to very specific, measurable thresholds of success. So that what you're talking about is not simply the upward trend. It's a trend toward thresholds for viability. And science can actually provide you with a lot of information about what constitutes viable populations. And it's not just the numbers of populations, it's the other attributes that I mentioned. I mean, there a comprehensive suite of measurable attributes that define what successful, what a successful restoration of the ecosystem would result in terms of biological response. And that not only gives you something to shoot for, it allows you to adaptively manage the system over time in order to adjust your implementation to better achieve those outcomes.
So you're okay with the goals, you just like them to be more specific?
Correct, yeah. There's nothing in the performance measures now that I object to. What I want is more specificity, and frankly, I could have reiterated the more specific performance measures we've suggested in the past. I was trying to sort of match the level of non-specificity that you had, and like I say, we think that there's plenty of information there. We're willing to offer you and work with you on more specific performance measures if, in fact, you're serious about trying to get them into this plan.
Yeah, Dr. Goodwin.
Is that on? Yeah.
You have to get very close to the mic, though.
Okay. So actually, Mr. Bobica, when you were making those comments, just looking around the room, everyone was nodding. And this whole question about performance measures, of course, we need to understand what we're doing. And just from the staff perspective, there's been a lot of discussion about that, and I think the plan is to have a workshop to take a very hard look at these performance measures in the next 18 months to 2 years. And I think that one of the questions that would come out of this, if you were to open this up now to have a complete suite of performance measures with all of the details, all of the scientific backing, the statistical design, and so on, that would be quite a hard thing, I think, to get a sort of community consensus of where that's going. So I think what I would suggest is if there are specific things that are not generically stated here without getting to very specific hard numbers right across the full suite, that would be very constructive. But to actually get to the specific numbers at this stage without being able to engage in a broader process, that would be a hard thing to pull off in the next 2 or 3 months.
Well, and let me comment on that, because I've spent a fair amount of time talking with Delta program staff and Delta Science program staff in the past about this issue, and understood that rather than try and get an inadequately prepared comprehensive suite of measures in this plan, it would the thought was it was better to take a bit more time to prepare a comprehensive suite and get it into a subsequent version of the plan. And given where we are, that's practically speaking, that's the way it's going to play out, and that's fine with me. I think where I'm trying to go with these overarching performance measures, and where I think, Randy, I'm trying to show where the added value is to say that I think there's some benchmarks we can identify. Those benchmarks being a period of time when we had better conditions. That gives us a benchmark to aim for, and that's for resident species, the 1967-1984 period, because that's when the data set is good, where we have really good data about when conditions were good. I think the idea that for migratory species we should be aiming at positive recruitment, populations that are able to reproduce at, to have a recruitment rate of 1 or more, which is what is intended by that population growth in all years. To have an overarching goal that we're going to reduce mortality, I could throw in a number from the recovery plans that, averages about, 5% or less. And these are things that are sort of overarching drivers, and then we should develop a much more comprehensive and potentially species-specific or habitat-specific set of performance measures subsequently. But these are kind of drivers, and they're policy decisions. They say, look, these based on what science tells us, these are benchmarks of a sustainable system. Let's use these as drivers of programs around ecosystem restoration. It makes it more meaningful.
Okay, I'm sorry, Felicia. Excuse me.
I was going to talk about this issue I mentioned a little earlier. I do think we should be a little more specific here. I also think we should commit to doing that more. In some places we say what we're going to do next, other places we don't. This is one where it cries out for the next step to be articulated. And I know PPIC is actually working on what is, I don't know what phrase they're using, modestly achievable. What does ecosystem restoration or species revival look like? And what is reasonable to even aim for? And it seems like we should have gotten a little further on that, again, knowing that we had a lot to do, but I think we should at least commit to doing
Well, and
what Gary says in a very comprehensive way.
We had attempted to do that on page 119.
Get closer to the mic, please, Dave.
We had attempted to do that on page 119 and 120 to talk about what ecosystem restoration looks like. I think when we get beyond that to trying to identify more than just some representative performance measures, especially in a field like ecosystem restoration where we've got recovery plans for various suites of species. We've got the joint venture plan for migratory birds. We've got folks who are giving us suggestions about what we should be looking at in terms of productivity of the estuarine system. To do that on the fly, I'm really reluctant to do that. What we try to do here is say, hey, here's some examples of some things that we can do. My own sense of performance measures is I hear everything from council members council members saying we should have 24 performance measures in total that are kind of red, green, yellow, good, bad, indifferent. I hear scientists saying, hey, we've got to figure out what the statistics are. I hear the media say, tell me something I understand, and the environmental community, the water community wanting data that's already being collected that fits into the way they do planning and management today. So I hear a lot of different things going on, and with the time we have available, I'm reluctant to suggest a way to resolve that other than to recognize that we do need to and to commit to we can work on that in the future, and here's some examples of things that we can do.
All right. My suggestion as someone reading it, you all are living it more than people who aren't on the council, is that doesn't jump out at you. It jumped out as being sort of thin, although I have to say I like this chapter and I like the rewrite. I didn't see as much targeting. It's like, I don't care whether it's in the performance measures or somewhere else, but the illusion in the front, you need a box. I'm going to be recommending to you a lot more boxes and a lot more maps to just say, look, even what you just said, this is complicated. Here are some of the measures we know of that are important. Here are the indicators that are important, and here's what we're going to do. Because it's implicit in what you know about what we can or can't do and your decision-making about what is too hard to do and the amount of time we have. But if we don't say more than we've said here, it looks like we're missing it looks like we didn't read anything that happened in CalFed. It looks like we're weak, and we're not weak. You've made a concerted effort to look at a ton of stuff. There's a ton of stuff on the cutting room floor because you're trying to make it readable in the white papers and others. So it's not showing the full depth of the work that's been done here and understanding about the work that's yet to be done in a pragmatic sense. So I'm just giving you that feedback, not trying to critique. I know it's hard, but you've got to at least then explain why it's hard and what we're going to do next.
Yeah. Mark?
You raised some good points, and I think Dan does too.
Mark, get closer to the mic, please.
I'm sorry. You raised some good points. I think Dan did too. As I look through this chapter and I look at the page 119 and 120, the bullets, what I saw those as is desired future conditions. That's what we used to call it when I worked for the Forest Service when we were doing ecosystem restoration. At first, you have to identify what do you want it to be like at some point in the future. And I think you've done a pretty good basic job. People would debate whether these are enough or they're rightly defined or not. But once you get that in play, I think the second stage of this is how do we get there? And I would offer up to you that's where the Interagency Implementation Committee and stakeholder involvement, people who are going to be involved in contributing to those restorations, whatever the form of resources are, and those that have an interest, that's where it becomes critical as you move to what I would call phase 2, which is what I think I'm hearing from you, Felicia, is we need to start identifying what it is we're going to do to fulfill these characteristics. I think the way you could cover that in here is if you had something in this here that says we recognize that we have to move at some point to an implementation stage. BDCP provides us some great opportunities to start doing that. How can we also use? It is the expectation of the council that we will use the IIC to. I guess it's just IIC, not IIC, to help us come up with some tactics, some strategies. I know that's what happened with the Northwest Forest Plan. They spent a long time identifying the characteristics. Then what they did is they put together the implementation components.
Can I make a specific proposal, Mr. Chairman?
I'm sorry?
Can I make a specific proposal?
Of course.
My specific proposal would be two things. The first is that the plan contain a much clearer and more detailed description of the development of the full suite of performance measures and a commitment
the
to
follow process.
Right. And so basically, when are you going to do it? Who's going to do it? What resources are going to take? What's involved? What's sort of the basic approach, the elements of doing it? So it's really clear. It's not a paragraph. But this is a section that just talks about how you're going to do it and that you commit to doing it and getting it done and getting it in the next iteration of the plan or whatever the appropriate milestone is. The second, to return to my bullet points of performance measures, is that you modify. You can't get. I'm agreeing. Given the resources and time, you can't get a full suite of performance measures. So pick some overarching performance measures. That's what I've tried to do. If you don't like mine, I'm sure that Dr. Goodwin and Mr. Wilcox and other folks who've been working on this for a long time can come up with others, or maybe they'll agree with mine. I don't know. But the point is that we've got plenty of information to say, look, here are some big drivers of the system. Here's some big benchmarks. And fine, we can build on these and make them, more specific later. But let's start with something that provides the guidance, the overall guidance. I've tried to do that. I'm willing to work with you to, refine it. But I would like you to try to commit to include that in the plan.
Okay, Greg, on this, is this on the same discussion? Because I'd like to wrap up the performance measures. Well, yeah, sure, but I'd like to wrap up the performance measures, which we've really been talking about.
The performance measures under your definition included policies and recommendations, right? So, I don't know what, there's performance measure stuff.
No,
but on this overall issue, at the risk of my job and maybe Gary's, I would say that late in the day he lurched into rationality, and I think we kind of agree.
Start tomorrow at 3 o'clock.
Yeah. Well, no. I think the proposal.
Comment drift.
The proposal is well taken, and to have a process, as Peter alluded to develop them, I think makes sense. And I will say that Gary's initial comments certainly seemed like when he's talking about shifting from a proactive and get out a single species approach and landscape certainly sounds BDCP to me. So we appreciate the endorsement. But
read the independent science report that came out today.
Yeah. Details.
Stop.
Anyway, in terms of the policies and recommendations and performance measures in Chapter 4, on page 145, it's an interesting statement at line 21 and 22, where it says, or 20 to 22, that because reducing or eliminating some stressors, especially the globally determined and legacy stressors, will be difficult, adaptation to unmitigable stressors is also imperative. I think that's true. The question then is, I think that's left begging, is does that mean that restoration and recovery expectations have to adapt also? So we suggest that that might be appropriate to think about. Down at
as we all come to lower our expectations,
well, no,
we
Mr.
could
Chairman,
hope that the debate would be more reasonable on all sides.
No, Mr. Chairman, you actually, I believe in one of your, maybe in the interim plan or at some point, you actually took some guff on this issue for indicating that maybe a species wasn't recoverable.
There was a letter that Mr. Grindstaff had sent off that he got yelled at by a couple of people.
Right.
But I give that talk all the time, just as I say that water contracts and theoretical water deliveries are not, in fact, capable
Divined for
if
anything.
the supply isn't. If the water isn't there, you can't deliver
Mr.
it.
Chairman,
I agree.
if I may, we've only got about 15 minutes. We're going to meet your schedule, so
Okay.
I think I want to see if
All
I
right.
couldn't encourage
Anyway,
you to get back on
it's
it.
consistent with
Hearing
that.
comments
Then
from others.
down at lines,
back into rational.
lines at 33 to 35, the statement that flows are insufficient to protect the delta, and it bases that, I'm assuming the reference to State Board 2010 is the flow criteria report, which, as we know, was not a typical report. It was dealing with issues exclusively on what was needed for the resources, wasn't looking at balancing and all those issues. So that is a concern that gets referenced. With respect to ERP3 on page 151 and or on 148 and ERR1 on page 151, what's interesting is the appendix on page C5 for both of those is inconsistent with what's in the document. Under the appendix, under ERP3, because I think the appendix tried to shorthand a number of these things. So under ERP3, it says elevation shown in the elevation map this is impacts to them, were avoided or fully mitigated. Fully mitigated is a term of art that has some concerns to folks. That's not in the actual language of the appendix in the plan, where it just says mitigated.
You would like us to fully mitigate?
We'd like to remove the word fully.
So you,
Avoided or mitigated. That's what's in the actual document, not in the appendix. There's difference. Which
Yeah.
Don't know why.
and you prefer?
We prefer not having fully mitigated.
You prefer what's real and not the
Yes.
summary.
Yes. Similarly, on ERR1, where it talks about 100% of proposed habitat restoration projects are within the 5 priority areas, that's not consistent with what's in the actual document.
Staff has already flagged that as an issue in their
Great.
detailed comment list.
Great. Then on ERR8, we appreciate this is in there, and I would also like to concur with Mr. Rentz's comments.
Page 154.
Yes, with Mr. Rentz's comments that generally this chapter is much improved, and we appreciate a lot of the effort. We would encourage you to go further than what's there now and actually recommend a mark select fishery, which I don't believe that goes to at this point. It's marking it, but the mark select fishery management is a separate issue that has been done up in the Pacific Northwest. We understand that it's been widely accepted as a great management tool. We think it should be recommended for here, and so go sort of the next step. Then on the performance measure on page 157,
157.
at the top. The first one, what's interesting is you talk about progress toward restoring delta flows, and then your metrics are results from hydrological monitoring and hydrodynamic modeling. Seems to be missing sort of an modeling. Are you getting any ecosystem benefit from that? Would seem a metric, sort of along the lines of what Gary was talking about. And then on page 131, this is a narrative issue.
131.
And it's in the sidebar, and again, we very much appreciate the change in tenor of the discussion and the functional flow discussion that we've gone through, and think that it's been improved dramatically. But there are two things I'd like to suggest. One is adding some language to this discussion that there are limits to what flow manipulation can accomplish. There are ecosystem functions that aren't subject to necessarily flow or impacted by the numerous stressors out there, and so not be responsive to flow necessarily. So we think that's an important point to be made, and so we're just not throwing good water after bad, so to speak, potentially. And then I need to raise this, the use of and reference here and also a couple other points in the document, at least one, of X2. We believe that, as is acknowledged in the document, is still subject to controversy and
So we shouldn't mention X2?
No, we think, well, we would suggest removing X2 and instead talk about a general discussion, the importance of the functions in the mixing zone, and what you've talked about as the important issue, you're trying to restore functions within the system, and not necessarily mention X2 or the fact that you use outflow to position the low salinity zone, and sort of talk again about the function within the ecosystem.
I can understand why you don't like some of the X2 calculations in some years, but it's at least a quantifiable measure as opposed to the kind of abstract arguing that goes on other things. What language do you suggest we put in there?
Well, I just suggested some. I think, you could talk about, X2 represents a specific measure. We get that.
Yeah.
You can talk about it that way. The problem is X2...
And it was actually the result, if memory serves me correctly, a massive settlement, including all the interest groups sitting at this table not too many years ago.
Well, but that was prior to federal district court kind of saying X2 may or may not be legit.
Certain parties appearing before the council object to the federal court's interpretation of X2 as exhibited in the following cases.
We don't need to argue, Mr. Chairman. I identified the point and our concern about it.
Okay. Dale, do you have anything you want to weigh in on this, please?
Nope. I'm going to pass in favor of allowing some time tomorrow for some of our flood issues to surface. Thanks.
Joe, I want to at least raise three things for consideration. I don't think this will surprise you. Neither the water supply chapter nor the ecosystem chapter have a suite of charts that illustrate historic flows into the delta, flows out of the ocean, and flows exported over time. So, for example, you've got a chart in here that talks about the changes in patterns of flow by month in either, these are DWR figures on page 124, either 2003 or 2006, I don't know. But it's hard. And I think the chart is a good one. It ought to stay in. But it's hard if you don't also put in charts on water coming in, water going out to the ocean, water being exported for as far back as we can find records. Just to understand it. And this discussion and all those implications weaves throughout this report. And if that doesn't justify some charts that are understandable, boy, nothing does. Now, I understand that the minute you prepare it, there will be an argument about what years to include, everybody choosing the years that best support the conclusion they wish a policymaker to make. I'm interested in the longest possible historic evidence. So the exchange I had with the water contractors almost a year ago, where they said we take the highest water year and the lowest water year in the last 10 years, and that's our range, seemed to me to be odd. But it's also true that there were more years than we had said in an earlier draft where there were 6 million acre-feet of water or more exported. I just want to see the facts laid out on those three elements of flows. And I'm agnostic as to whether they are in Chapter 3 or in Chapter 4. But the background material is really important. That's number one. Number two, on the performance measures, I don't know what you're going to be able to make out of it, but I thought Gary's suggestion of more clearly defining what the activities are after the Delta plan's adopted in the performance areas does make sense. If I were to just have my own way, which you don't have, I'm not going to get, I'd probably tell you, look, for each of the big policy chapters, get 3 things you can actually measure, maybe 5 under some circumstances. Acknowledge they're imperfect, acknowledge they're based on evidence that doesn't completely solve the problems, but just start using them. We've talked about the dashboard we want on our website where we have indicators of success or failure. This is a point where scientists keep telling me, well, we don't make public policy decisions. You guys make public policy decisions. Well, a decision to protect endangered species is a public policy decision. Maybe the law, but it's not. That isn't quite how scientists, as best I can tell, think about issues. Native species versus non-native species is just a construct of public policy. So for me, that's where I'd take the major chapters. They're, like acreage of land in farm production. That's, there's a way to measure that. The data may be 2 years old, but there's a measure. What's good? Land staying the same, maybe some more. What's bad? Less land. I mean, they're not perfect solutions. They're not balanced. They're not fully integrated. But if you don't start with something that can be measured, I'm afraid we don't meet the statutory requirement of performance measures. And rather than promising generically, I'd promise specifically, and then the more complicated ones that have to be sophisticated become part of that process after. So those are kind of my suggestions. Carl? Yeah,
I'd just like to volunteer our help in doing that. So, I think, as Gary pointed out, there are some things that could go in there as indicators of whether or not we're making performance relative to some goal. And so that would be done.
I'm sorry, my third and last point. We've been passing this out for 2 years, but as we search for a way powerfully to say things about the Delta and the problems, John Hart did a dynamite job in the Bay Nature magazine a year and a half ago, and you've quoted him in one part in Chapter 1, but everybody keeps rewriting the same thing, and I just recommend there's a lot of benefit to be gained from just using one good writer's description of a problem rather than us rewriting all the things ourselves. Mark, last comment, then we're going to get public comments.
I would just say I concur with your second point there. I guess you're still going to have a third one. You said you had three, but maybe not. But I agree with that. We have said since the get-go, even back in the interim plan, that performance measures are critical. I think you may be hitting it, Phil, on the head too. Also, though, we need to recognize that performance measures are evolutionary, and so don't create performance measures too early on in the process that commit you to things that maybe the science or the resources that have available to you can't fulfill. That's the only comment I'd make. But otherwise, I think the notion of developing performance measures in consultations with your scientists and other experts is a good point.
Okay, good.